This is a reading of Her Eyes by Bozorg Alavi, translated by John O'Kane. Chapter 1. The city of Tehran was gasping for air, but no one managed to draw a breath. Everyone was afraid of everyone else. People lived in the fear of their own families. Children feared their teachers. Teachers were afraid of the school janitor. The janitor was afraid of the barber and the bath attendant. Everybody was afraid of himself, frightened by his own shadow. Everywhere, at home, at the office, in the mosque, behind the scales in the bazaar, at school, at the university, in the public baths, people felt the secret police were looking over their shoulder. In the movies, when the royal anthem played, everybody looked around to see if some madman who didn't care to live any longer would stay seated and cause everyone a lot of trouble. A death-like silence reigned over the whole country. Everybody made believe he was content. The newspapers published nothing but eulogies on behalf of the dictator. People were starved for news and secretly circulated fantastic lies. Who would dare say publicly that anything was wrong? Was it possible anything could be wrong in the land of the King of Kings? Even in the streets and in the bazaar, you were struck by the people's sadness and apathy, their mistrust and despair. People avoided looking around them in the street for fear of being suspected of something. A scorching sun made the streets of Tehran unbearable. No one knows who told the municipal authorities that the streets in Europe have no trees. With saw and axe, they were cutting down all the age-old trees. Narrow lanes were being destroyed. Whole neighborhoods were being torn down. People were made homeless, and it took years for a new house to be built in the midst of this wasteland. And what did get built was all battered and misshapen. Meanwhile, from one end of the country to the other, they built prisons, but there still wasn't room for all the prisoners. From east and west, from north and south, aged men and 10-year-old boys, theologians, peasants, grocers, bath attendants, and water tank cleaners were thrown in jail for having dreamed at night and wished in their dream for the downfall of the dictatorship. They arrested school children along with ministers and members of parliament. One man was arrested for talking in a barber shop about a caricature of Shah that appeared in a French newspaper. Someone else for having associated with representatives of a foreign state during a visit to Europe. Another person was charged with having sold shares of Southern Petroleum to British capitalists without the government's knowledge. It was in these circumstances in the year 1938 that Austin Macken died. Austin was the greatest painter Iran had known in the last 100 years. After several centuries, the works of a Persian artist had again found buyers in Europe and art magazines in Europe, and America published reproductions of his paintings. Few persons who used to applaud his arrival in the classroom or at public gatherings now had the courage to declare their admiration for him openly. Nonetheless, in secret, many people admitted that Austin Macken was one of the rare individuals who had shown courage and daring, and beaten his fists raw fighting the dictatorial regime. Stories circulated about him. People spoke of how there was no form of deprivation he feared, of how he had no emotional ties. Except for his painting, he had no attachments. Despite all the pressure the police of the dictatorial regime brought to bear on him, they were never able to break his spirit. It had no effect to threaten him with physical violence. When they cut off his income, he appeared indifferent. They banished him from Tehran, but he stood by his views. Finally, he died in exile, far from his families and friends. Ordinary people said love of a woman had caused his downfall. Those who knew better believed it was the love of life that brought him to death's door. The day news of his death was released in Tehran, his friends and relatives spoke together in a whisper. They noted that once again someone had succumbed to a heart attack. Such was the routine statement in the press concerning victims of the regime who died in prison or in exile. Perhaps it was one of Osted's friends who had influence with the government, or more likely it was on the initiative of the government itself that was aware of Osted's high standing among the intelligentsia. Now that one of the unrelating foes of tyranny had been eliminated, they thought it was a good idea to make the most of his death. Above all, they wanted to keep the world from knowing with certainty that Osted had been murdered in Iran, especially after the scandal concerning the defection of the chief of police. Consequently, they gave Osted a state funeral in Sepah Mosque. His corpse was brought to Tehran with all due ceremony, and he was laid to rest in the shrine of Abd al-Azim. In Amir Kabir High School, they set the speech makers going, and an exhibition of his works was put on in the Teachers' Training College. In this way, the government intended to display its willingness to foster the arts. But no one swallowed the deception. Even the splendid edifice of the university itself, since it had been established by the direct order of the dictator, was considered in the interest of the British and harmful to the country's independence, so it was hardly likely people would believe the painter Osted had died of natural causes, especially as his death occurred while he was in exile. The official mourning ceremonies, with all their pomp and solemnity, were bound to appear artificial. All the high-up officials and dignitaries of the day in suffocating Tehran, members of parliament, ministries and generals, all the blustering enthusiasts, came to the opening of the exhibition, took one look and said it was wonderful and left. The show was meant to be on for a whole month. The first days, only students, supporters, and close friends of Osted came. They stood some time gazing at his paintings, above all at his last canvas, which had been brought to Tehran from Kalat, and paid homage to his awesome skills and his power to portray human emotions through line and colors. Afternoons, to avoid a loss of face on the part of the government authorities, the Ministry of Education sent a group after group of school children to visit the exhibition. But by the second week, going to see the works of the artist Osted took on popular and national dimension. Crowds of people turned up to see his own selves, for in Osted's paintings of clear color and solid form, what they found portrayed was themselves. In particular, they stood with fixed gaze before the painting, which had written below it, in his own hand, her eyes. They discussed and argued among themselves, tried to grasp the mystery of those eyes, that one moment seemed to express such emotion and the next looked forth in utter calm. People wondered what secret they were hiding, and then again what exactly they revealed. Everyone said what he thought, but opinions differed widely. There were disputes. By the end of the second week, the crowds had become so disruptive, the government and the police concluded that looking at paintings was a mass protest instigated by discontents and detrimental to the government, and at the beginning of the third week, they closed the exhibition hall. The painting, Her Eyes, was no more than a simple face of a woman, the elongated face of a woman whose hair flowed down over her shoulders like molten pitch. Everything in the face appeared subdued. The nose, mouth, cheeks, and forehead were indicated in dark colors. It seemed what the artist wanted to say was that the owner of the face no longer existed in the external world, and only the eyes had left a lasting impression in his memory. The eyes peered at you with a strange magnetism. It wasn't that they displayed impudence, yet they removed the veils between their owner and the viewer, and got into the person's heart. What wasn't clear was whether these eyes were on the verge of shedding tears or whether the woman was about to laugh sardonically. But there was no indication of laughter around her lips. The eyes might have been narrow and slanted because she was smiling and giving encouragement, or by way of oppressing someone with a broken heart. Were these the eyes of a chaste, withdrawn woman, or those of a woman who was self-indulgent and pleasure-seeking, who was on the lookout for a victim? Were they filled with desperate longing and seeking, or did they try to conceal everything? while inciting their prey into a trap? Were they honest and sincere, or deceitful and daring? Did they express indifference, or did they beseech and appeal for help? If they were beseeching, what was it she was after? This look, these languid, half-intoxicated eyes, what contradictory tales they seemed to tell. In one sense, nothing about the face was exceptional, with its high forehead, fine straight nose, and delicate chin, its high cheekbones, fine lips, and silken hair. It was not the overall effect of her features that made a special impression on the viewer. The woman was very beautiful, but what amazed the beholder was not the beauty of her face. It was rather the riddle and the mystery of the eyes themselves. The eyes were delicate and slightly slanted. At times you looked at the painting and were moved to tears. Other times, on the contrary, you imagined a woman who was torturing the painter with her look. Then you experienced a wave of revulsion. But none of the painter's friends or relatives believed a woman had ever played an important role in his life. Only one woman, in fact, sat for her for a while as a model, and no pictures of this woman can be found, nor is there any likeness of her in the painter's works. When Ostad was exiled from Tehran, he was a bachelor. No one knew of a woman having had any influence on his life. He spent over 3 years in Kalat and died there. For the first few days, the newspaper paid no attention at all to this important event. Only the official government press reported Ostad's death with 2 lines. But then suddenly everyone was shedding crocodile tears. Now they spoke of a glittering star having set on the horizon of Persian art. Those who knew Ostad said, even if some important event did take place in his life that led to his banishment to Galat and his death, still Ostad, that quiet man whose sentences never exceeded 2 or 3 words, who only replied if you put direct questions to him, and then with no more than yes or no, wasn't the kind of person who would reveal his inner secrets. Certainly not to a woman with eyes like this. One point was clear. Ostad was reserved and kept his secrets to himself, and he was never happy with the dictatorial regime. For a while every day the poets of the age composed lyrics in praise of the Shah and played the sycophant. No one could say Ostad had done the Shah's portrait. Ostad's devotees wondered why he chose to name the painting Her Eyes. He might have called it simply Eyes, yet it was her eyes, the eyes of the particular woman he had in mind. Clearly, the focus of attention was the woman who owned the eyes, not the eyes themselves. There on the frame below, in Ostad's own hand, was the title Her Eyes, the eyes of the woman who had brought him happiness or led him to disaster. The eyes of a woman who, in any case, had such an effect on his life that while in exile, enduring the torment of his cowardly oppressors, he still thought of the owner of those eyes and was stirred to paint her portrait, even if a purely imaginary one. There is no doubt about this portrait being imaginary. No one has any reason to believe that in real life Ostad knew a person with a face like this. One may perhaps speculate that if this woman had no place in Ostad's private life, she may at least have played some role in his life of social commitment, which in the end led to his exile and death in Kalat. Many people became curious to discover whose portrait this was. They dismissed from consideration those who were in Ostad's immediate surroundings. They didn't find that the portrait resembled any of Ostad's female friends or students. Several girls from distinguished families in Tehran had taken painting lessons from Makan. Ostad would go to their homes, but all these girls had been mere children and none of them bore a resemblance to this portrait. Furthermore, none of them was of such character that she could have altered the course of life of a man with Ostad's will. not to such an extent that despite all that deprivation imposed on him by the police with regard to his painting materials, he would still conceive the idea of doing her portrait in Kalat. No, the woman who served as the model remains a mystery. No one had seen her. Oster never appeared with her at a party or at public gatherings. The only person with any definite knowledge about the unknown woman is Aga Rajab, the painter's servant, and he does not remember anything in this respect, or if he does, he is not telling. Besides, Aga Rajab says he does not see a resemblance between the eyes in the portrait and those of the unknown woman. Why did Oster paint this portrait? Was it his intention to have it sent to his beloved after his death as a token of his fidelity and devotion? Or did he wish to inform this woman, whose eyes had taken him prisoner, that he had come to know her as she was incapable to knowing herself, and that he realized she was the cause of his present torment? And perhaps he wanted to say, Eyes, had your mistress been here at my side, I'd had the strength to endure and reach my goal. But what was it Oster had understood? And how had he come to know this woman? What can be inferred from her look, from the indefinable expression in her face? This is all sheer fantasizing. Until you can decide what this look is and what emotions are in these eyes, how can you answer any of these questions? More than 10 years have gone by since Oster's death. The dictatorial regime has been dismantled. Today, the outstanding figures who put up a fight against tyranny are subjects of everyone's admiration and respect. As for the question of the eyes in this painting, it has still not been forgotten. There is not a single upper-class woman, especially if she had some slight connection with one of Oster's friends, relatives, or students, who does not claim to be the owner of these eyes. They all talk themselves to be his beloved, and every one of them, as accords with her moral and social type, pretends she was on intimate terms with Oster. Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana, who is today the wife of a brigadier general and the gendarmerie, and whose separation from her husband, along with 5 children, recently caused a scandal, was not more than 17 or 18 at the time of Oster's exile. In one of his paintings, the face of a woman appears that to some extent resembles Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana when she was that age. Oster had illustrated the following quatrain of Khayyam. The sky's rotation ushers in our end. Time plots against our unsuspecting souls. Reclining in the grass, rise up the drinking cup. Soon grass will spring from our own dust. Oster rendered the grass, the leaves and branches of the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush in the form of human heads and faces, and features of one of these faces were not unlike a photo of Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana when she was 17 or 18. Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana took this as an indication that Oster was in love with her, and the proof was that when he saw an engagement ring on her finger, he squeezed her hand so hard in anger it caused her pain. Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana's life had been full of upheaval, and the scandal sheets which one day supported her husband and the next were hostile to him, shamelessly published this story. Nonetheless, Oster's life and comportment vis-a-vis people of all classes was such that even Khanum Sokhul al-Sultana was unable to say any more than this about him. During the years following the events of Sa River, recounting love stories from the life of Oster was common practice in the newspapers. Journalists brought forth incredible incidents from their repertoire of lies and deceit. In particular, the journalists used all their wild fantasies to tie in the story of the defection of the chief of police, Brigadier General Aram, with the life, exile, and death of Oster, and the most ghastly tales were dressed up. Fortunately, this story have subsided, and now little by little, the moment is drawing near when someone might take a deeper look into the career of Ostad during the period of dictatorship and clear up the mystery that shrouds his life. I have spoken with most of the women who knew Ostad, or who had at least met him several times. If we dismiss the outer shell of egotism surrounding all their remarks, not much is left. Whoever I questioned about Ostad talked about herself. Even the unknown woman had more to say about herself than about the life of Ostad. What's clear is that Ostad's relationship with all these women, whether his students or women he met at private gatherings and spent some time with, was friendly and sincere. The only exception is the unknown woman. If anyone knows something, it is her. And yet, Ostad was a reserved, taciturn man. He rarely revealed himself. Maybe what the unknown woman has to tell is no more than her own fantasies too. In general, what I learned from this woman is that Ostad Macon was a secretive man. Most of the time his face was stern. It was rare for him to indulge in pleasantries. With his acquaintances, especially with women and his students, he spoke frankly and honestly, and it didn't matter to him whether someone liked what he said or not. He never passed on remarks, good or bad, about other people, and it displeased him if anyone practiced backbiting in his presence. He spoke very little, and the little he said had more to do with his work than with day-to-day affairs. No one claims to have been a bosom friend of Ostad. He didn't maintain close personal contacts. It was unusual if he accepted an invitation to lunch, and yet the door to his own house was always open. Although he never invited people formally for lunch or dinner, he received his guests as well as his means allowed. The greatest Iranian painter in the last 100 years died at the age of 44, and during the final 20 years of his life, anyone of any real worth knew Ostad and respected him. At that time, many notable and distinguished persons in Tehran were proud of the fact that they had one of his paintings in their home, or at least a copy by one of his students. Still, no one really knew him. No one had penetrated into his interior life. Ostad was a quiet man and didn't allow anyone access to the inner chamber of his heart. The hidden passageways of his soul were a storehouse of pain and suffering, and Ostad never wished people to know what he was enduring. He always appeared content and in good spirits, and no one could have guessed what turmoil seethed inside this orderly, unpretentious man. One day he said to a student who had been courting his favor for some time, "How unfortunate the country in which I am a master. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Nonetheless, all people of any worth were eager to make his acquaintance, if only to flatter their own vanity. Even the previous Shah couldn't ignore him. One day towards the beginning of his rule, when he still didn't consider it superfluous to court people's affection, he went to the painter's newly founded school and made a tour of inspection. When he was about to depart, he stopped before getting into his car, and giving his right boot a few taps with his riding whip, he said, "Where did he pursue his studies?" "In France, Your Majesty, and afterwards he spent some time in Italy." His Majesty turned around to say a few words to Ostad himself, but noticed that the painter had stopped on the steps in front of the school and was about to light a cigarette. The royal dignity was offended. As he turned away, His Majesty remarked, "Yes, obviously he spent some time in France. Where else would he get such bad manners?" The clever courtiers and opportunists on hand reapproached Ostad and urged him to run to the car and throw himself at the feet of His Majesty and beg forgiveness. At first, Austin was quite alarmed. He threw away his cigarette and took a few steps down the stairs, but he showed no sign of haste. His Majesty got into his car and was driven off. As a result of this incident, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of National Economy and the Bureau of Fine Arts never paid any attention at all to Ostad's art center. And so matters stood until he was transported to Kalat, where his life came to an end. Men of distinction wanted Ostad to do their portrait. They came and asked him in person. They beseeched him. But even during the period when he most needed help, he never stooped to such baseness. On the other hand, he did several pictures of Aga Rajab, his servant. The paintings Ostad did of this simple loyal servant, who was surely one of the persons closest to him, reveal how deeply he'd penetrated the character of this ordinary man, and with what precision he could record his different moods. Perhaps an important reason for Ostad's friendship and concern for this present from Hamadan was that he saw some of his own qualities reflected in this trusted servant. Aga Razab too was good at keeping a secret. It would be difficult to make him reveal anything against his will. Ostad came across Aga Razab in a village called Farjak in the vicinity of Hamadan. The painter had stretched out at night on the roof in the moonlight, and the crying of a baby in the neighboring house kept him from sleeping. Toward dawn, Ostad rose to his feet and straightway went out to look for the child. He discovered it was a 2-year-old baby suffering from diarrhea. It had started vomiting and was on the point of dying. Aga Razab and the child's mother crouched by the dirty crib, waiting for it to die. Ostad washed the child in warm water and wrapped it in one of his own shirts. He gave it a few pills, and the following day, when the child had recovered, Ostad painted its picture in watercolors and gave the picture to the father. 2 years later, Aga Razab popped up at Ostad's house with his second child who was suffering from the same illness, and his wife and 4-year-old child. He had gotten Ostad's address from Karbaha Hossein, the agent of the local Khan, and come to have Ostad cure his child, since no one in the villages around Hamadan knew how to perform such miracles. From then on, Aga Razab with his wife and children lived in the house of Ostad Mekan. As far as I know, Ostad left behind over 20 sketches of his loyal servant and has portrayed him in stages of anger, agitation, fright, confusion, and indolence. In one of these sketches, Aga Razab is asleep. His body, his arms, and long legs are indicated with few lines, and his face appears placid and inscrutable. Ostad attempted to reveal the inner man, but the viewer is unable to grasp anything definite. All that is visible are the painful effects of a past full of hardship. In the museum of Ostad's famous art school, there are a few watercolors and oil paintings of Aga Razab, and though the school's name has changed several times, Aga Razab himself is still here. Even though he is apparently only the janitor with a janitor's wages, in reality, he is much more important than that. In fact, he has the authority to do anything he wants. Even I wouldn't dare move a painting from one place to another without his consent. Aga Razab is not given to talking. He does not remember anything about Ostad's past. Even when it comes to the important events that everybody else familiar with, you'd have to force him to remember. According to Aga Razab, Ostad had only once been willing to do a portrait of one of the important men of affairs, and that was Keltas, who after a trip to Europe returned to Iran covered with glory and at the height of power. In that period, most people regarded him as one of more account than the Shah, and considered him the real dictator in Iran. One day while Kheltas was in Paris, his photo appeared in illustration. One day while Kheltas was in Paris, his photo appeared in illustration. He appeared descending the steps of the Palace Elysee. They say when Ostad saw this photo, he was pleased and remarked, "He's certainly head and shoulders above his master. Let's hope he can preserve Iran's dignity." I've seen this photo in illustration. Kheltas with his broad chest and his head held high, and yet with no trace of artificiality in his bearing, in descending the steps with dignity and authority, as if he had just achieved some great success. When Kheltas came back to Iran, Ostad made it known to the minister's friends that he would like to do his portrait. A few days later, His Excellency came to Ostad's house unannounced. When he'd spent half an hour looking at Ostad's work, he said, "I understand you were a student of the Italian Stefano. I see his oeuvres during my last visit to Paris and made his acquaintance as well. He himself told me that you'd study with him, but I don't see any resemblance to him in your work, or even an influence of his école." Ostad replied, "How can you compare my worthless work with the paintings of Stefano? I was only one of his students. It's normal that the influence of his teaching is not obvious in my work. Still, I try to follow his school." Kheltas smiled and said, "Don't be so modest." A few days later, Kheltas began to sit for Ostad. He would come 2 or 3 hours a week, whenever he found the time, especially in the middle of the day. He would hold the book in his hand and read, while Ostad worked on his portrait. After a few weeks, perhaps it was the 5th or 6th sitting, Kheltas was seated in an easy chair reading, and Ostad was painting with watercolors. On that occasion, the minister looked up from his book and said, "His Majesty is very interested in your work." Ostad raised his eyes from the palette he was holding and replied casually, "Thank you very much." For a while, perhaps a whole minute, Kheltas kept his eyes fixed on Ostad. He knew, of course, that what he'd said didn't please the painter. But when he perceived that there was no visible reaction at all on Ostad's part, that perhaps he had said thank you without giving it a second thought, Kheltas became red in the face and screwed up his eyes. Kheltas hadn't expected flattery and hypocrisy from Ostad, but he hadn't expected complete indifference either. Kheltas was waiting for the painter's eye to look up, when Ostad had dipped his brush in the paint and was about to add a stroke to the picture. He looked at the minister and was surprised by the intense anger he found in his face. That instant, Kheltas asked, "You wouldn't like to do a portrait of His Majesty?" Ostad's complexion changed. His lips turned as white as plaster. He let out a false laugh, putting down his brush on a table, and removing the palette from his thumb, he came forth from behind the painting. "No, thank you," he said. "I paint pictures of people I want to paint. Look at these faces all around you. These are the faces that interest me." The dignified minister's eyes maintained their intense expression. He glanced swiftly at the pictures around him. The gaping mouth of a snake chamber about to bite the head of a snake caught his attention and stirred up his disgust. Ostad was about to leave a room, but Kheltas, who was a man of imposing character, rose from his armchair, placed his hand on Ostad's shoulder. "You have my full respect," he said. "I understand your position." "Respect?" Kheltas interrupted him. "Don't take this the wrong way. You have been very kind." For a while Ostad was alone. After half an hour his servant entered the room and found him seated on a stool by the window. Ostad, with his elbows propped on the windowsill, was holding his hand in both hands and staring at the sky. Seeing Aga Razab, he came back to his senses. He rose from the stool. With a knife for scraping oil paint, he slashed Khalta's portrait and tore the canvas off its stretcher. Then he put on his overcoat and left the house. Aga Razav remembers that one day Ostad gave him a letter, which he took to the ministry and delivered to the attendant attached to His Excellence's office. He never saw Khaltas in Ostad's house again. A few days later, that same servant from His Excellence's office brought a letter and gave it to Ostad. I found this letter from Khaltas among Ostad's paper. Here is the exact text. Dear Ostad, I'm sorry you have stopped working on my portrait. I hope, however, that one day, when you find the opportunity, you will devote your attention to finishing it. Sincerely yours, Khaltas. Despite this incident, Khaltas always accorded Ostad the utmost respect in public. At that time, a well-known scholar from India came to Iran, and a reception was arranged in his honor in the hall of the Ministry of Education, which seats up to 250 persons. In the first two rows sat the high-ranking officials. All the government ministers, several members of parliament, and other hangers-on were present. In the fifth row, Ostad could be seen. A few minutes before the Indian scholar arrived, Khaltas entered the assembly hall. Those who were sitting in the first few rows immediately rose to their feet. Khaltas, indifferent to everyone, found his place and sat down, and the others sat down again as well. Then he noticed the Prime Minister sitting a few seats over from him. As he got up to join the Prime Minister, he caught sight of Ostad and said, "Good afternoon, sir." The painter didn't notice. A few people said in a loud voice, "Ostad, sir, His Excellency is kindly addressing you." Ostad half rose from his seat and nodded without any sign of pleasure or impoliteness in his face. Khaltas said, Please don't disturb yourself. When we consider the different events of Ostad's life and try to fit them together like so many links in a chain, it becomes clear that some secret is connected with his life. The events do not form an unbreakable sequence, and yet there seems to be a mysterious thread running throughout them. Until the nature of this thread is established, it will be impossible to join the links together. A person who could remain unaffected by the fear of the former Shah and, at the same time, behaved as we have seen toward Khaltas and was not susceptible to any form of intimidation, he was never even afraid, with the result that, in the end, he died in exile, was perhaps murdered. How is it possible that a man like this would be captivated by a woman's eyes? From the first day, the idea occurred to me to write the history of Iran's great painter. I realized that if I didn't find the unknown woman whose eyes appear in the painting, all I could write was what had been published in the newspapers. I had read the police documents too, but there are no clues in them either. Even his exile was by verbal order of Brigadier General Aram, and he is no longer in Iran, but is said to be living a life of leisure in South America. I have dealt on Ostad's connection with Khaltas at some length. My purpose was to show that even Khaltas, the most powerful statesman in Iran at the time, after Reza Shah, the most powerful man in the country, felt obliged to pay homage to Ostad. You must not imagine that politicians in the dictatorial period were patrons of the arts, and that Khaltas wanted to show his appreciation for artistic genius. The point is that the painter Ostad commanded respect and had influence among the intelligent people. By addressing Ostad at official gatherings, Khaltas increased his own reputation. In that period, the pillars of dictatorship were not still firm. There were still elements in the imperial government of Iran, like Khaltas, who would not bow to every form of disgrace. In the outlying areas of the country, rebel elements still had their hopes. From time to time, individuals or small groups appeared that hadn't given up all resistance. There were individuals like Osted who, in the face of oppression and injustice, were prepared to sacrifice their lives for the rights of the people. By behaving this way, Khaldas in fact thought he could exonerate himself. Furthermore, the mere fact of Osted's existence was a means of propaganda for those who had recently risen to power in that period. Everyone who arrived from abroad was taken to see Osted's works. For instance, an American dealer in antiques who posed as a professor and connoisseur of the fine arts made himself a fortune buying up the illustrations Osted had done for a collection of Khayyam's quatrains. At the same time, he went around telling stories in Europe and America about how the regime in Iran patronized the arts. A photograph of Osted seated in an armchair playing with Aga Razab's children was published in American magazines. Aside from his painting, the most effective weapon Osted possessed was his detachment from the normal bonds and formalities of society. Having abandoned his family, which was originally from Mazandaran, he lived in a relatively large house behind the Sefer Salar Mosque. It was an attractive house. In the summer, tall trees, plain pomegranate and boxwood cast a pleasant shade around the pool, and in early spring the roses Osted had planted in large flower pots diffused a fresh, moist scent that even penetrated into his stuffy dark studio. Osted earned a good income selling his paintings to people of social standing, but everything he had and more was spent on behalf of Aga Razab. Although he had little interest himself in life's luxuries, he made every effort to ensure the comfort of Aga Razab and his children, one of whom was 12 years old by the time Osted was exiled to Kalat. He looked on Aga Razab's children as his own. He lavished on them all the love his heart contained and refused them nothing that was within his power to give. Aga Razav's son, Firuz, had no fewer toys than the children in a middle-class family. He sent Firuz to school, and the young boy's relation with his fellow students were not as if he was the son of Aga Razav. In any case, Osted himself lived in 3 rooms. One room was where he worked. It was filled with all kinds of paintings, books in French and Italian, stretchers, paint, cardboard, canvas, a few stools, and other requisites of a painter's studio. Most of the time, this was where he took his meals. Sometimes he even slept there on a wooden platform. In another room, he received his friends, and a third room, where he called his bedroom, was full of books and paintings. He usually hid the paintings he didn't want to show to anyone in this room. Aga Razab relates that summer nights when the sky was dark blue and studded with jewels, Osted would sometimes climb onto the roof. Late at night, when Aga Razab and his wife were sound asleep, he'd quietly come down and get his portable bed out of the studio. Carrying the bed back onto the roof, he'd stretch out under the stars. On those occasions, he'd stay awake all night until dawn. When the sun rose, he'd carry his bed downstairs and go to sleep in his studio, which was hot and stuffy in the summer. Memories of Aga Razab. Disjointed memories even a reticent man cannot refrain from uttering. The only biographical data that can be gathered on the life of that unusual man, Osted. Unfortunately, Aga Razab is a simple illiterate. For instance, he doesn't know what year Osted painted his various paintings, and so the only key that exists for unlocking the mystery of his life becomes useless. Or when he does know something, his memory is rambling and disconnected. For instance, he says he thinks it was the same year the tall man, he means Khaltas, that Osted painted the peddlers. Or it was around the time the mister from America bought pictures from Osted. No, a year later, that the unknown woman began posing for him. Or when his second son started school. Osted did a sketch of Aga Razab lying under a tree, asleep. And yet, Aga Razab is smarter than he lets on. It's unthinkable that Osted could have lived for over 10 years with a man as stupid as this. No, Whatever the secret is connected with Ostead, this peasant from Hamadan knows it. The only thing that puzzles me is why he won't say a word about it. How I tried to get Agarazab to disclose something, even the slightest piece of information, about the unknown woman who, in my opinion, had to be the owner of the mysterious eyes. He had forgotten everything. He couldn't remember whether Ostead had finished the painting or not. He didn't know how old the woman was. He couldn't remember whether she was good looking or not. He had forgotten how long they went on seeing each other. This much he remembered. When Ostead finished working, he would personally see her home. You never went to the woman's house? No, I don't remember. Think maybe you can remember her house. I don't remember. Do you recall the painting Ostead made of the woman? No, sir. The woman was not nude? No, sir, she was a woman of decent morals. I know, but Ostead did paint nude women too. Well, yes, Ostead painted those in Europe. There are no paintings like that here, not that I know of. What do you mean, Agarazab? It's obvious from their faces. Some of these nudes are Iranian girls. But how could you convince Agarazab? He simply refused to believe it. For him, Ostead was a paragon of purity and self-restraint. It was unthinkable that his master would commit any act contrary to the tenets of religion and decency. Agarazov had created a master all for himself, and it was impossible to extract the facts of Ostead's life from this fabrication. Time and again I tried to make it clear to Agarazov how important the particular painting, Her Eyes, was. I tried to make him see what a secret must have been hidden in this painting. It wasn't just a question of Ostead's skill in rendering the mysterious eyes with their various moods and different meanings. I wanted him to realize that if we could discover what her eyes expressed, we'd be able to understand a fundamental aspect of Ostead's life, which had remained hidden and was necessary and valuable for people of today to know about. After all, it's not clear what happened to make them exile Ostead from Tehran. What had he done to make them send him to Kalat? The fugitive chief of police said that he'd received orders to kill the painter. But why? I wanted Agarazab to realize that if we knew who the unknown woman was who spent time with Ostead during his last days in Tehran, sat for him for a while as a model, we had a chance of finding out why Ostead was exiled. It might even be possible to prove that he was murdered in Kalat. These questions, after all, are important to people. Above all, to know about these matters would be useful for the younger generation that is carrying on the struggle today. Agarazov is a stubborn man. I cannot believe that a man who spent over 10 years in Ostead's house and did all kinds of jobs for him wouldn't know why Ostead was arrested. I've spoken hours on end with Agarazov in my office in the art school which today bears Ostead's name. Agarazov is perfectly aware of how keen I am to find the unknown woman. He listens to me with a composed expression on his face. He doesn't bat an eyelash. His facial features show no sign of surprise, joy, sadness, or stupidity. You might well wonder whether this fellow is really so calm and self-possessed or just an absolute fool. It's impossible to tell whether his memory has in fact faded or whether he's fixed a seal of forgetfulness on his lips. Whatever you ask him, he answers calmly and firmly with yes or no. And yet, every now and then, his eyes seem to grow dim, as if something is gawning away at his heart. Nonetheless, he remains unwilling to take you into his confidence. It is as if he considers it an act of sacrilege to reveal Ostead's secrets. In the midst of his imprudentability lurks an element of agitation. You have the impression Agarazov is making an effort to keep some distress from getting control over him, and to maintain the mask he wears. Sometimes my patience runs out. I say to myself, he's just pretending to be stupid. He's a lot more clever than he lets on. This kind of behavior is well and good in its proper place, but he had better take into account that as of August 41, I am the superintendent of this art school and Agarazov, damn it, is a janitor and is one of the underlings. A few days ago, I asked him, Agar Azab, you really don't remember at all the face of this woman who posed for Ousted? Now, who said that, sir? Well, can you tell me what she looked like? Certainly. I was taken aback and asked, how is it you can suddenly remember? His answer was, because she was here a few days ago. What did you say, Agar Azab? What was she doing here? She was one of the visitors in the museum. What day was she here? Thursday in the afternoon. Then why didn't you tell me? Sir, what do you expect? It's not right. The moment a woman comes to look at Osted's painting, for me to come running to tell you just like that. During the weeks that followed, whenever the museum was open to the public, I sat the whole day in the exhibition hall myself, and I ordered Agar Azab to inform me immediately if the unknown woman appeared, but she didn't come. I examined all the permits issued to visitors that Thursday. There were 15 women among them. Out of that number, 5 women had been alone, but none of their names corresponded to a girl or woman I knew Ousted had been acquainted with. From that day on, I personally kept a notebook and recorded the name of everyone who visited the museum, and I committed to the memory the names of the 5 women who had come unescorted. One of them only had written her first name and concealed her family name. The name of this woman was Faranges. Suddenly a light flashed in my mind. The unknown woman had appeared on the 20th of December, and the 20th of December, 1938, was the day Ousted had died.